You know what I love about this book thus far is that, there's exploration of really, really deep topics and literally naming shame and being vulnerable in that. And I love that sometimes for me, the reading gets intense, but the nature of the book itself reminds me, oh, I could take a break. Oh, there's no shame in having to take this in. I remember a couple of days after Thanksgiving, I wasn't struggling, but I had been near my family, and then I had to start doing the reading because, hello, I get paid for book club. So I'm trying to read the book, and I remember feeling like, oh my God, I can't address or even receive some of these things that they're talking about right now after being so close to my family for so long. Like, I'm not sure if I can do this, but the nature of the stories themselves reminded me, like, actually, I don't need to walk in a space of shame or vulnerability. I actually need to bring that to book club and share it with y'all. And that's what I love about the book. This is what I'm naming, like that contrast. And I'm wondering if folks, as they're reading or going through essays, do you feel yourselves kind of like, oh, this is heavy, but I want more? Do you feel yourselves in a space of like, oh, wow, I've never thought about things this way, I need to take a break? Or are you more like, wow, I've never thought about things this way, or I've seen things this way, I need more of this? Like, I love to know how folks are kind of balancing those feelings and navigating their own stuff, their own feelings of vulnerability and shame.
Well, some of it I identified with because I lived through it.
Please, yeah. So what does that do for you when you're identifying means what then?
It depends. I mean, I was halfway through Kiese's, the one gentleman who was afraid of going to the doctors.
Yes, Kiese.
Kiese. I was halfway through with him at the last meeting, and then I finished reading it, and then I was like, I was angry, but there was an overwhelming sadness too, because I actually did have a friend who was not treated well when he was young by doctors. And ultimately, that's what ended up killing him in his mid-40s, because he was so, he refused, he was so afraid to go to a doctor that he had an infection that could have been handled easily. It got out of control and it killed him. So it made me sad, but it also made me angry because I actually knew someone who experienced that fear to the point where it actually ended up killing them.
Right. If I can ask you, EJ, in that anger, is there any moment of like, oh, wow, someone has written these feelings that I know that are true? Was there any sort of help in that, in seeing some of these things that you know to be true written out in someone else's story?
It did, because it was because I was looking at what he was writing and realizing that he's still struggling with this fear that a white doctor is going to kill him. Ultimately, that the medical profession is going to kill him.
Absolutely.
But it also, I mean, if I could talk to him, I could say to him, it's not just a white doctor. It's the way that the medical field is set up. And it doesn't matter what color or nationality the doctor is.
Right.
Because there's some doctors out there who are Black, or from other nations, and they're just about as, some can be just as cold and, have no empathy or whatever for their patients when they're talking to them.
Right.
To even understand that they are causing a problem.
Right. And I think you're right that he's naming he's saying it like white doctor, he's naming exactly what it is.
Right.
But I think I think the thing that I took from that in the same note was like, oh, and medicine itself, regardless, is what you're saying, regardless of a doctor's particular race, Western medicine itself is very white in itself, right? It's a white lens. It's constituted through certain bodies. We know the ways that Black and brown and non-white bodies have been used in Western white medicine, right? Like none of it is accounted for us. So naming that what you're saying is real. He is talking about a specific white doctor, but I think when we look at the system itself, we could also just say that, right? Like white doctor, white perspective, white lens. And I want to thank you for sharing that.
I would say Paula too, because I'm a school social worker now, but I used to be a hospital social worker.
You better talk about it.
It's just overall, that's how the doctor's main objective is just to treat. So they don't really care about feelings or anything like that. It's just like they just try to look at like, okay, this is the problem, this is how we're treating it. And that's it. Either you're on board or you're not. So yeah, they really lack a lot of empathy.
Right. And
humanity, like just like, you know, they have a lot of pressure on them too, you know, but it's just like they really do lack a lot of humanity too. It's like robots.
And how do you think that affects, well, in this particular, we're talking about the Black experience, like how do you think that affects the Black body when there's a lack of humanity in medicine? And Kiese writes about it, EJ just shared it, but you said you work in the hospitals, right? Like, how do you think that affects it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely rooted in the kind of like institutionalized racism, because I used to work at like Bronx 11 in the Bronx. So yeah, and it's like, you know, there's stigmas that come in with certain populations of people and things like that, you know. So it's like even though they're treating something, it's like they really lack the humanity. And you're talking about treating humans. So it's just really interesting. Yeah. That's why I had to get out of there.
Period, babe. Any other thoughts around this? What are folks' names?
I didn't mean to cut you off. I want to share. I work in the Bronx. I live in Brooklyn. That particular one really resonated. I like that it validated a lot of what I felt during this COVID, then the reckoning during COVID. And everyone can say Tuskegee, and I'm like, I don't trust doctors. I'm professionally employed, I've had healthcare, but the system doctors change. So my primary care will change. They'll go in, being plus size, they don't talk to you. There's a screen. So I understood I really appreciated the honesty of that piece and the validation of that particular one. Never kept saying Tuskegee and the history. I said the current system really dehumanizes people in such a way when you go in. It takes months to get an appointment, to move through, and things that manifest, you know, during the time you're trying to see someone and get approved for labs. So I appreciated that piece, and also the reality of who died during this health crisis, and who, you know, if there's a wave coming, who would pass again, if you will. So that part, I think the other one, I started reading it. I missed the first one because I didn't have the book yet, but I started reading it, I think between yesterday and today. So it was a lot when Paula, you mentioned sort of to read and take in, to do that. And because I'm a fast reader and I can get through chunks of reading, but that was a lot to take. I was sitting in my car picking up a friend, and I almost cried in a car. Because because while they were intense, what I appreciated was there was actually joy. There was a lot of joy in the pieces I read so far. I'm up to the point. I'm at the last one where the educator with the camp for students. I'm sorry, I don't remember the pieces I'm on.
Oh, you're fine.
On my Kindle thingy. There was joy though. There was a joy of turning a corner. That didn't mean they were done or complete, and everyone says in process, but I actually appreciated the joy of just realizing I am not, what's what I say? I'm not crazy. There's a certain crazy. There's a good crazy. That was awesome. So I appreciated the work each writer took to really move through the messiness and at least try to name the messiness. But that the doctor one hit me because I didn't want to go see doctors. I didn't want to go. I went to get tested. I came back home. I was like, I don't want to see anyone. But so that was my part to it. I agree.
You've brought up hundreds of millions of amazing points, and I don't know where to touch first, but I do want to thank you so much for sharing and naming, just touching upon what we're naming, and EJ, connecting the thread back to EJ, that in this health crisis, we've all, as you know, people who've had to experience themselves outside of white body, had to ask themselves, like, well, what does this look like to me? What does this health crisis look like to me? How am I navigating it in the community around me? especially when so many of us don't have access to healthcare necessarily, but we're given access to, and this is not I'm not gonna say book club is not a political space, because like, hello, we're all here trying to read and navigate stories of people so that we can thrive, not only survive, right? We're here emulating the stories that we're reading and bringing our own. So I'm never gonna say book club is not a political space, but we're not gonna slice you open here for a political stance. But what I'll name is that everyone has had access to the vaccine, and us as Black people who don't have access to healthcare have to reckon with that, right? We have to be in a space of, how much do I trust to take care of the community around me? And ask ourselves, what does that look like taking care of myself? And so I just thank you so much for naming that and bringing that up. I know that for me during the pandemic, I had a mistrust of doctors as well. And it's something that runs deep in my family. And once I got the vaccine, I understood then that like, I need to have more onus toward my own health and advocate more. And this is not even about a vaccine. And I also, just for full disclosure on public record, no, it's no kidding. I have Medicaid. So I deeply feel that systemic exhaustion when I go to the doctor and when I try to make an appointment. I feel like, some of the things you've named, Lisa, around not being seen due to characteristics and physicality, like definitely not the same plane, but in my own plane, right? Like I'm not seen, I'm not heard. I'm also super vocal. So, it's frustrating for a baby like me. Like, I'm like, listen to me. So I felt all of that anxiety. I feel like Kiese touched it. Just want to put it out there. And thank you, Willie, too, for naming your experience working. Does anyone else, did this resonate for other people, this medical piece around the trust of medicine, or did it touch upon kind of what we're naming today?
Well, it happened to me a long time ago. And I think it was at a military hospital, but I kept going back. I had just this awful headache and kept going back. And they kept telling me there wasn't nothing wrong with me. And then I don't know, I think it just got so bad, and I went to the emergency room. And the next thing I know, I was being loaded onto a helicopter going to Duke. I had 3 brain aneurysms, 3 of them.
God.
I had 3 of them, yes. And one of the doctors, he was Black. I don't know if he was African. One of the times I went, I think. And then when, after I came back, and then I checked in with them and everything, but then he came to me and he was totally different. He was totally different when he came back. So it's a miracle that I'm sitting here. I had my head cut open. And thankfully, this was a long time ago, but I had to keep going back and keep going back and keep going back. The pain was just out of this world. So, and I don't trust them because of that, but to be honest, and thankfully now I have a Black female doctor for routine appointments and stuff like that. But and I feel much better, having her. And this is still with the military, so, but I just feel much better with her. I feel much better with her. So
you're naming like having to go back, but also reckoning that like I have to, because this is my health. But where does that trust come from if I don't trust it?
Exactly.
Naming that now. Thank you for naming too that now you're in a better situation.
Exactly.
Let's just do a little a little clap in the air for Black women doctors. It isn't me.
Yes, definitely.
There are
Thank
many.
you, Lord.
Shout out to them. Thank you, Lord. Gotta find me one.
There's a belief that Black people can tolerate more pain than white people, so that they're when they come into doctor's office or hospitals, the doctors don't take them as seriously because they believe, I don't know if that's still the case, it might be, but for a really long time, that was the case. There was a belief that Black people can just tolerate more pain.
That's
right. Or trying to get pain medication because they're addicted to it.
right.
Right.
Intolerance
And I think
comes from slavery, right? The idea that because we're in labor, Black body can take more, do more. And then we also see, of course, because of the epidemics and the drug wars that have happened in our communities, naming that then we're addicted and we want these things. We also look at the statistics of Black women in labor. You look at the statistics of Black trans bodies being able to acquire transition surgery. There are so many examples. Black men's health. How many Black men's health centers, really men's health centers alone, but Black men's health centers exist, right? Like thinking about, think about medicine in our correction system, right? And our So thank you all. What else? What else is coming up for y'all?
You know, there was one funny piece, at least it was humorous, how when Kiese goes into the hospital, I know this was last week's reading, but it's fine if we want to
Yeah,
talk,
we still talking about
continue
it.
to talk about it. But he says he has this James Baldwin, Nina Simone affect when he goes in to see his doctor, like he's trying to elevate. He's almost, I mean, we know that, you know, if Nina Simone is born in Mississippi, and James Baldwin is born in Harlem, they're not gonna sound the way they do. I mean, people select how they sound often. But the way Kiese kind of like, you know, adopts this when he's going to encounter white people is just interesting, like how he hears voices and how he thinks those voices will give him, just the voice alone will give him access. He can come in there, a big black man sounding kind of, you know, whatever kind of accent Nina and James had, and
Like
that'll be okay.
like debonair almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, it provided, thinking about that voice combo, I thought was hilarious and gave a lot of levity to like that real fear. It's like, you know, what his name is like, he almost sounds ridiculous, right? Like trying.
But that's that fear, you know, that fear will make you do things like that and rationalize it.
Absolutely. Are there any other stories at this point? It could be from this week, last week. Don't give me next week's though. This week or last week. Are there any other essays or stories? You know, I know we also read Prentice's essay.
Yeah, that really resonated with me. Like I felt like I had to I'm listening to it and I just had to keep stopping and just like take like a deep sigh like every time, because it was just like so heavy. I even kept rewinding and I wrote a quote down that she had said, if I could share it.
Please do.
It says, "I come from people who have survived some of the worst and don't make a practice of looking back. We have moved through always with our culture, with our joy. And we were taught that you move through because you have to. It's what we've always done, sometimes even to the neglect of our own healing." And I felt like that was so powerful. I felt like, even from my own personal experiences, you know, and just knowing that you just have to keep pushing, you know, and sometimes you don't get you don't get the time to really process, or like, you know, or you feel like the kind of shame for kind of processing, right? With like, oh, am I like having a pity party here? But no, it's like some actual real shit that we're dealing with that we have to like stop and just pause for a second. And I felt that Prentice's story like really, really highlighted that the power in healing and taking like, you know, self-auditing and things like that.
Right. And that the self-auditing process, it's not one thing, right? Like Princess is literally naming, it kind of can look like the mess as well. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah, I think even when I think it was her story, I believe. Excuse me if I'm getting it wrong, but like when she talks about like the roaches that like stomping all hard in the room before like her friend went, like, you know, and the shame in that experience, right, of poverty and things like that. It was just like, it was so many layers to that story, as with every story, but I just had to keep pausing and then just breathing through it.
So people are nodding. Something that's come up, again, y'all are sharing a little bit like this, you want more of the story, but you have to take time. Let's just talk as a group real quick. What are ways to take care of ourselves as we are navigating these stories? Willie, I think you said you took a moment and you breathed. Did you do anything else?
Just reflected. I think like certain times too, I had to come home and take a hot shower and like really do some self-care, because this book is heavy. Like it's very heavy.
Lisa, I know you also named too, having to take those, or just feeling that juggle of heaviness, but also wanting more. Can you share with us how you took it, how you're taking care of yourself or other people as well? I'm only picked on Lisa because Lisa had spoken earlier.
No, I didn't want to pick on. I had for a while, I think since COVID, a lot of them, and I've been reading the books, but hadn't been joining. So this one did surprise me a little bit because I caught online with this fiction or the collection of short stories. So I picked this one up, and I hadn't really read the background to it. I passed sort of the introduction. So
Yeah.
moving into them, I was sort of stunned for a bit.
Yeah.
Because I've been not avoiding, but really trying to ease back into the kind of breathing and safetyness of after the really, it was honest because I started menopause. I don't know what the deal is as well, but that the COVID wasn't just a public health thing. It was a real reckoning and having 3 young males, Black males in my house and what that means. So it was a lot. So I was a little surprised. But I did like the Apprentice story. I was pleasantly surprised. That's why I realized that this is one of the joy places. I'm not watching the news. I'm not following this podcast. So it was stunning. But when I moved into this, and I'm reading it today as I come from the doctor, and I got to the Apprentice story, and I agree a lot of the sort of the roaches and stuff. And I just sort of paused. I did feel the kind of cry. And one of the stories talks about crying. One of the guys says the masculinity of crying. That's when I found myself about to cry. I was like, I'm on 166th Street. I don't know if I'm gonna cry right now, but I'm sitting in my car. But it in terms of, if you get my thing, really, it sort of shook me, and I think I'm still sort of feeling that a bit. But I let myself feel whatever I felt. If I was gonna cry, I was gonna cry. I was sitting in the car, I think, waiting at that point to pick up someone. But I also think about, because I work with kids. I'm an educator in the Bronx, and so, it also clicked off into other places. Right. And I think that's why I realized the joy here. The people, the writers were about, I had this space and I'm not in this space. If I had to go all the way back to, I am such and such, the daughter of such and such, or I am this, or I found this, and if you kept reading, even if I couldn't get there, once they got there, then I could breathe again, if that makes sense.
You're literally there with them trying to get to
I just had to stay in it. I agree with you. If I had to pause, I had to pause. But each of them found that moment of breathing, which has been so important the last 2 years of all of the frustration and anger. They reached the breathing part again. And if you stuck with them, then you could exhale too.
Absolutely.
That's what happened to me in the car today. But yeah, that roaches thing is real. I remember I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. I remember hearing rats in the walls. So to this day, if there's a certain kind of scratching, it's like a visceral response. There's a visceral, I could almost heave if I hear it.
I think even if you've never heard it, it's heave worthy, okay?
Yes.
It's a very scary thing, like animals in the wall.
Yeah, but you can, it's those kind of old apartments.
I appreciate y'all sharing sort of the ways, and this question is forever until we finish the book. We're going to revisit this question next week and the week after. I want us to kind of talk about what does it mean to take care of ourselves as we read through. And so there's 2 points I want to go into, because you mentioned the essay around masculinity, and I want to talk about that, and maybe this will lend into it. But quickly, I want to share that Kimberly just named that Apprentice story touched her a lot too. So thank you, Kimberly. And Tiffany named that the book is heavy except for Lovey's part. I say Lovey, but sometimes I say Lovey. What is it?
Lovey? Lovey. It's Lovey.
Lovey. Yeah. So the book is heavy except for Lovey's part.
Yeah, I mean, hi everybody. I like Lovey, but I felt like just the chapters that we were talking about were so heavy and personal. And I felt like her chapter was way too light, like way too cash. And she's capable of doing much more depth. So I was disappointed in that, especially I think since it was coming right after Mark Lamont Hill's story, which is so important. It's such an important conversation to have. And he was so vulnerable in his expressing these conversations that Black and brown men need to have. And then they followed it up with hers. So we don't even have to discuss her. We can just discuss him, because I think somebody else brought that up. He was... It's just such it's an important conversation.
We got it. Let's go. We're getting into it.
I do think Lovey's... I'm sorry. Go ahead, PJ.
I mean, actually, in the makeup of the book, you need something light in it, otherwise it would be too heavy. Just from a standpoint of putting a book together, it's like there are people, because I'm a poet, so I read a lot of poetry books, and you can have a very heavy subject, which these are, but you got to balance it with something that's not so heavy so that you don't lose the reader. You don't want the reader to become so heavy with it that they can't continue. So you break it up with something lighter. Now, I'm not saying that her piece shouldn't be there. It's just that they're putting it in basically because, this is a mental break. It becomes a mental break in the book. So it may have been actually designed and planned that way.
I do wonder, EJ, if as we continue the book, we'll see if things are spaced out in a certain way. I think I understand what you're naming, a thread. Any good book, story, piece of music, it all has that balance. And I want to name Tiffany as well, that part of me did feel a little bit like, oh, this is awkward here. I wonder, and also thinking about Brené, like, is this Brené's way of trying to take care and just like being like, let's just put like a softer thing here for a moment? I took that as many different ways. So I like that you both are naming this right now, because I was like, yeah, it feels awkward, but I guess she's trying to provide some levity. But the story didn't hit for me.
I've listened to a lot of Brené. Yeah, I've listened to a lot of Brené, and she has a thing on Netflix that you can watch her when she's doing one of her talks in the auditorium. And she does do that. She'll hit on something that's very heavy, and then she'll go into an anecdote of some part of her life that makes the audience laugh. And then she'll go back into something that's really heavy. Right. And then you hear this collective from the audience when she does that. Right. So I'm not saying that it necessarily works in the design of this book, but usually that's what they're trying to do when they put something light in there like that.
Yeah, you recognize her. And I want to name something that we brought this up. Tiffany, I think you brought it up. You was here with us last week? Remind me, my brain's busy. Okay. I just made up 4 different dates apparently, so who knows what's going on. But when you was with us last week, I think we spoke about how also, or it wasn't you, but you were in the conversation when we spoke about how I wonder how, even though Brené is in an extreme sense of awareness, there's still a whiteness to her as a white woman that's trying to be in this space. And I wonder how that's going to show up. And maybe it doesn't affect the stories at all, but let's name that it's a very slight reflection of, if Brené Brown works in a way that like, here's a little bit of heavy and here's a little bit of light, that's also showing up in the book. How does that change the story? What does it look like if she doesn't have that influence there? You know what I mean? So I just want to name that. You're bringing up a fair point because it reminds me of what we said last week. And the last thing I'll say about this, and then I really want to move into Mark Lamont Hill or anything that y'all have to say, is that what I like about these stories as well is that even though they're heavy and they deal with a sensitive intensity, and I think someone else said this, there is a hopefulness, more beyond hopefulness. I find peace as I read these essays. Unlike most things that are heavy, I have to trudge through because I resolve that the author may not give me peace right now and that I have to finish the story. But here, we get to consume it a little differently. I'm not saying the book remains at this tone at all. Who knows? It may get more intense. It may give us more levity. But I think the authors were chosen in a particular way because their essays give us both. So then it poses the question, is Lovey's little thing necessary? Maybe. Maybe not. We'll see as we go through. But how do y'all feel? Do y'all feel like it's very intense to read everything, or is there also moments of vulnerability and hope? Do you walk away from every essay fucked up, or do you feel like, how do you feel? How are we walking away as we're reading the story?
I think
everybody.
With Libby, I think it was important about her name because didn't her family want her to have the name and then other things? And just like when I got married and we were in the military, I wanted a hyphenated last name, and my husband said no. Okay. So I think
Beyonce Knowles. But keep going.
So I think for her, I mean, and then the title part of the other, the small part of the title was vulnerability, shame, resilience, and the Black experience. So I don't know if that's part of it too, you know, so it's different things. So, but for her, that was a big thing as far as what her name would be. And then what do they call her too? That's another thing.
Right.
And then she won her husband's last name too, so.
Right.
Right. So to your point, and it reminds me of what EJ is naming, that like the shame looks different. It may not be as intense, but it's still there. And she's giving us something else. What else? How else do folks feel?
Well, on the name thing, I have a niece who is named Imani.
I don't think it froze.
Oh no, Linda. No.
Are you back?
Are you back? Tell us about Imani. Oh, I think you're muted, Linda.
I'm just having all sorts of old lady problems. Imani, as she got older, she wondered whether or not she was going to be discriminated against, because her sister's name is Brianna. My daughter's middle name is Ayudele, and she thought about that for a while, and she's like, you know, am I going to be discriminated against because of the way my name sounds? And for a time, that really bothered her. So I think the name thing, it's light in some way, but it can be very significant. My husband was in the military, and when we got married, I wanted to keep my name, and the military said no. So, you know, I mean, the name thing, I think maybe we shouldn't write it off as being a light story.
Well, that's true. My father, when he went into the military back in the 50s, he was born L.J. That was his name, LJ. He went into the military and they told him he could not have his name. They made the L Lawrence.
Oh.
Wow.
Because they refused to let him have his name. But just to show you, when my brother went into the military, into the Air Force, 20 or however many years it was later, they let him keep his name. His name was LJ Jenkins Jr. They let him keep his name.
Wow.
But my father in the 50s, they gave him a name. They refused to let him go in with his name.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that date back to? Other people giving us names. Right. You know, I mean, that's so that there may be more layers to this than we're you know, taking into account here.
Well, then she should have wrote about that.
Say it again to me. Sorry,
She should have wrote about that. That's what I'm saying, is that the way she executed her chapter was just very light. And she didn't really get into depth. I don't remember her saying, oh, I was just so embarrassed. I had so much shame towards my name. She was just like, yeah, they can't pronounce it, so let me just change my name to Love It. And it just did not seem as heartfelt and depthful as all the other writers. And it could have been a light chapter, like you guys suggested, but I feel like she could have done a little bit more. And I hope that's not Brené's influence. You know, I don't know where that came from, but it's noted.
I would agree.
Book club.
There was the moment when she called her friends about what's her name and have to decide, and she had the two covers to her editor, and the editor chose that. I thought that was a moment that was kind of in a naming thing they chose. She said it was a commercial naming, but then, you know, I don't know if she was masked, you know, it's about wearing mask, or I couldn't get quite a handle on either, but I thought that was powerful that here are two covers with both names, you pick it, and the editor chose.
But like, guys, people in this book are talking about like serious issues, like serious generational trauma, shame, sexual abuse. Like, people are talking about serious issues, and she's talking about, you know, oh, this is my name and people are going to mispronounce it. It just didn't fit. It didn't work for me. It's not working.
That feels important to me. I mean, it's not as important as, you know, sexual abuse or you know, issues around queer identity, but when you migrate from another country, that's been the story of this country, regardless of race. But it's worse with Black people when you consider our history. But you come here, and there's usually, if you came through Ellis Island, there might be one person that gave you your full name, didn't know you, didn't know your history. Just if you said, yeah, I'm Italian and I'm from a small village called St. Hope. Your name was St. Hope. And that was that. There was no conversation around it. And I think she's at least trying to have a conversation around her culture more than I think we're giving her credit for, because it's really about her Ghanaian culture, one, and how she tried to distance herself from it, then welcomed it back into who she is as a person, and stop trying to run from it.
But Ron, like you just said, I think what she's trying to say, like, she's a writer. If that's what she wanted to say, she should have said it. She ain't saying nothing. That's what I'm trying to say.
He's not moved now.
She talks about her given name and how her given name is, and it was hard to pronounce. And then when she went to school, the teachers couldn't pronounce it. So then they were like, oh, that's a hard name. So then they wanted her to have something easier for them to pronounce. And here she is, she's been called a certain thing for 9 years of her life.
Right. But what I'm saying.
No, Tiffany, I hear you. And it's like, we're making, because what you're saying is that we're also creating these like super grand, amazing thoughts out of the story she's given, not necessarily what she's saying.
Right.
And you're like, tell me how you're feeling, because people are literally opening up their mind. You can't even negate what Kiese is naming about being afraid of doctors, because not only is he telling you the experience, but he's literally saying how he's shaking in his boots as it's happening, right? And how he's sounding ridiculous. And what I want to name here is and y'all forgive me, because I'm a big TV movie nerd, but it reminds me of almost like a movie. Sometimes in films or sometimes in TV shows, you'll start off with the TV show and you get like all of those characters' inner thoughts, and you know how they feel and you know what's going on. And sometimes they'll throw an episode where it's them just going to the supermarket and you're like, whoa, I thought this person was an astronaut. Why are they at the supermarket? But it's a chance to kind of just see them tell their story by showing you what's going on with them. And sometimes that's a hit and sometimes that's a miss. And it did surprise me that in an essay of so much telling, that here came this essay where someone started to they thought that they were going to give me the point off just by showing. And some of us it hit and some of us it didn't, but it reminds me of just TV shows like that, and some people prefer episodes like that. That's like, oh my God, did you see that episode that had nothing to do with the plot? They just went to the supermarket. Amazing. Because you kind of, the character, the world itself is showing you how this real life vulnerability, how this real life shame, how this real life trauma is existing. It's less of a reflection. And I think Tiffany's naming that, like, my Black body wants the reflection. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that you're saying that, Tiffany, but I'm just saying like, that is okay too, And some of us, and I guess I'm on the younger side here, but I also understand like wanting to be told and wanting to hear it. And I appreciate the wisdom of some of us who are like, she's showing us, she's showing y'all. Take a minute, sit with it, read it again. So shout out to y'all. If we have nothing left to say about it, which we could always talk about it even more, y'all want to talk about Mark Lamont Hill and about this toxic masculinity? That's my song for it. Toxic masculinity. What is the thing? A lot of men, especially in this climate, in a post-Me Too climate, right? A lot of cis men talk a lot about masculinity and toxic masculinity and patriarchy and where they exist on it. What is moving you about, what speaks to you about what Mark Lamont is saying? What is Hill's point in this?
I think a lot of this, it's just this idea of having to play catch up. And I hate the fact that I relate to it, because it's like, it's admitting that, like, even because, he's a grown man, he's in his 40s, right? Yep. And it's the idea of like, you have been walled off and not vulnerable for so long and have been steeped in these climates that, encourage misogyny and all this other stuff, that when you finally play catch up, or you're, being more accountable for how you are, I don't know, it just, you can't help but notice all the flaws in it. So part of that's probably just me reflecting back but I'm recognizing him as well, where he's like, okay, yes, he took the feminist courses in college and it opens his eyes, and it's all these moments that is like, setting him on the correct path, but it still comes with its hiccups as well, as he says with the story with the podcast with Russell Simmons, which, I remember when that happened, and exactly, that was my reaction. But yeah, that was basically the way I felt about it, is the idea of like, as men, it's just this stunted development thing. So it's like trying to catch up to being this more fully realized, I don't know how to describe it, because
Yeah.
it's
Can I ask you a
personal,
question?
but yeah.
And anyone who identifies as a cis man can answer this or not. This is not a pressure thing. I just want to, something you said really intrigued me, because you named that feeling of like, oh shit, I in many ways connect to this. Like I feel that, right? And that feeling of maybe shame, right? Or vulnerability, or a sense of like, oh shit, I know exactly what he's talking about. Where does that come from? If our society, and anyone can answer this, I guess, but where does that come from if our society itself doesn't really shame men for being emotionally stagnant and things like that, because I think you're naming something really important, Greg, that like a lot of men go and they try to start the right path and they take courses in college and they try to talk to the community around them. So where does the shame come from? If we live in a society where essentially men have, where's the shame? Right? Even in this Me Too, post Me Too conversation, it's we stir up a conversation to begin the process of understanding shame. It's not necessarily that men are having these conversations and like, whoa, everything has stopped. So I'm just wondering, where does the shame come from? If you're able to share with us, for you, when you read that, what makes you go, oh shit, that's me? Is it because you want to be, I don't know. I just want to know, like, where does it come from?
I mean, I guess it's just being steeped in those environments that allowed or enabled me to want to think a certain way for so long. And then when you grow out of it, you realize like, oh, that's not healthy at all. Like the toxic environments of being in private school settings and just very patriarchal settings where you're like, this ain't good, but like everyone around you is enabling it.
Yeah.
So it's like, you never questioned it. And then once you kind of get out onto the other side, there's always work to do, obviously. But once you get on the other side, that's like when the shame comes in, because you realize, oh, wow, that's like the wrong way of living and the wrong way of operating. And it was for so many years. And it was because, it was encouraged. Right. And it's the other thing, too, of like no one should be patted on the back for this either. That's the other thing where it's like, I shouldn't be patted on the back. Mark Lamont Hill shouldn't either. And I think he recognized that, too. It's like doing the work is like, it's the bare minimum that you should be doing. So it's not the kind of thing like, oh, aren't I so great? I'm reading bell hooks in college. Like I'm super, understanding of words. So, yeah.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for naming that. I just appreciate that. Ron, yeah.
A lot of it comes just from society. When a couple of people were talking tonight, talking about taking their husband's name, that's patriarchy. When I spent Thanksgiving with my mother, and it was just a few of us there this year, but normally, when I was younger, there'd be a house full of people, the men ate first. Not because, but listen, not because the men rushed the table, the women invited the men to the table to eat first. This is just how it was, in school, men's sports are given even now, are given a different priority than women's sports. There are all these different things that we just kind of like fall into that is perpetuating a patriarchal society. And it's not like I'm calling anybody a bitch or a hoe or anything like that. That's not it. It's the things that we do every day that is based in patriarchy that we have a hard, like, since I was a kid, I never understood women taking men's names. Don't ask me why this rung in my head, even as a kid. I never understood it. It seems so weird, but there's women, they're not having it. If they can't take their husband's name, they're not getting married.
Right. It's a but you got to look at it from the historical point, because in this country and other countries around the world, we have more agency now in this country, but in other countries, and before we had the agency we have now, women were considered property.
That's patriarchy.
Yeah.
It's the patriarchy. We didn't, you know, when my great grandmother wanted to buy land in the early 1900s, she couldn't buy land in her own right. She had to get my great grandfather to buy the land in his name because women weren't allowed to purchase.
Absolutely.
They weren't allowed. You know, Lucille Clifton, God bless the dead, she told a story that it broke my heart when she told it, but I understood it. So back in the 40s or whatever, when she was a teenager, her mother actually was a poet. She used to write poetry. And one of the newspapers in wherever town they were living in, she sent something in and they wanted to publish her poems. And she went to her husband and she told him, well, look, I have this letter. They want to publish my poems. And he refused to let her publish her poems.
Right.
Because at that time, he had the right to tell her that she couldn't do something. And she was so heartbroken. Lucille Clifton said her mother went down into the basement to the boiler, to the furnace, and she threw all of her poems in there and burned them up. He broke her heart. But that was normal for the time period. The men had the right to tell you that you couldn't do something.
Right.
You know, my grandmother, believe it or not, I always thought this was normal when I was growing up because my grandmother was always, as far as my life was concerned, she was the pastor of a small church in Harlem. I thought that was normal. And I learned later on in life that that was not considered normal and that my grandmother was doing something that even the churches themselves didn't want to allow to happen.
To this day, churches have problems with women leadership. And I want to name that, like in a 2021 Greenleaf, Lynn Whitfield, I know y'all watch Greenleaf, in a Lynn Whitfield climate, even while we see, you know, media reflecting women as church leaders, it's still a problem in our community. But I want to touch on something real quick. And thank you, EJ, for naming your family's legacy, because I think a lot of us can relate and understand and connect to, oh, Lisa, don't leave us, but we love you. Thank you so much.
I apologize. I thought it was sort of 8, so I got to do some night routine. But
next week.
I look forward to finishing the book, and I'm glad I finally made it. I'm so sorry I have to go. I can't.
No, you're the bomb. Don't worry about it.
Sorry. I look forward to finishing the book with all of you.
Thank you. Enjoy your leftovers.
Thanks.
So I want to name a point that's bringing it up when EJ talks about legacy and all the ways that patriarchy has affected it. I'm sure we all in this room could trace back to our families, particularly in Black and brown body, and kind of name what that looks like. And I want to touch on something for a second though here, or I want to bring it to your point. If we come from a society, and Greg, thank you, because you kind of touched on it and named it. I'm just wondering what other people are thinking. If we come from a society where this is norm, and it's not just Western culture, we could all dig back to our own ethnicities, right? And name like, oh, snap, this is something of the people of my island do this, or the people from my side of the country do this, right? If this patriarchy is so embedded and there's no shame to it, what causes shame then? What causes Mark Lamont to write the essay? What causes Greg to reflect and go, oh my goodness, you know what? Let me reflect. Oh man, now that I see it on this side, that sucks. Everything that I've been living in the past, I'm questioning a little bit now, right? And Greg is not saying he's doing this now. I'm sure Greg has been doing it for years, but relating to the idea that it needs to happen now. Why the shame now? Why vulnerability now is the question I'm posing to the group. What's happening now that patriarchy is feeling a sense of shame and accountability? What's going on?
Equality.
Me too.
Yeah. Me too, equality. What do y'all mean? Talk about it.
Women want equality on all fronts, on every aspect of, you know, society, whether it is vocational, avocational, whether it is personal in the home, you know, women just want to be treated equally as they always have been, and been striving towards, you know, this moment since women have been in this country that long.
And I don't know who said me too, but when you said me too, was it in line with that, Tiffany? Was it like?
Yeah, it was. And also I think just social media has expanded the voices of women the same way it has with, like, you know, Black and brown people and the uprisings last summer. I feel like people who are just like, oh wow, that's how you feel, really? And they're just waking up like they would have never woken up in the past, maybe 2 decades ago, the way they have in the past few years. And so,
Right. I guess, thank you so much. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make here, and is something that Greg touched upon, is that you often don't experience the shame or the guilt or the vulnerability, right, until you're in the space of reflection. Even if it happens beforehand and you kind of do something fucked up and you're like, oh, I don't know if I should have done that. That full sense of shame and accountability does not come until you're in a space of reflection. And what I name is that right now, we can see in a 2021 climate in the United States, we are in a deep space of reflection, right, as a society. And what I'm naming is that Mark Lamont Hill is touching on patriarchy, and we're receiving it as a men issue and a women issue. But this is also inclusive of women. This sort of patriarchy that he names is also, of course, he's talking about serving women, but women are included in this. Because I think what we're seeing as a society is a greater definition of gender, right? It's not even just women having to be treated right, but how are we dismantling the role of man itself, man versus woman, whatever that looks like. If we live in, sorry, can someone just type in the name of Mark Lamont's essay inside of the chat for Shanice, because they have to pop out. I just saw that. If we live in a 2021 climate, is Mark Lamont Hill's essay only about being able to give equality toward women in the Me Too movement? Or are women also responsible in many ways to think about how they themselves impact or reflect that? I'm curious as to what y'all think.
Well, it's interesting because the piece, I think, before his is about the women in the love lifted me, about the experience of women in the Black church. Mm-hmm. And I'm reading this and going, yeah, 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 okay, yeah. And it's like, when you know, I'm thinking about it, I'm going, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly what the church sisters did. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So it's like women learn to maneuver within the structure that they're in.
Yep.
And this, what it was, she wrote a comment here that they said that about the women, that the man was the head, but the head couldn't move without the neck, and the women were the neck controlling the head. Mm-hmm. And that kind of made me laugh, because I think, you know, and this is not just specific to the Black church, because I'm a Lutheran now, which is a predominantly more of a white congregation, and the women in the church, you know, they're kind of gently sitting to the background, you know, the older women, and they're like, okay, well, you know, and they kind of, you know, directing things in the background, you know.
Directing and projecting, right? So this
exactly. It's kind of funny, you know. To me, it was funny.
But it does kind of, that's where shame also comes from too, right? Because they have a responsibility. So sometimes that projection leads into shame. And what I'm naming is, and eventually we're going to read Laverne Cox's essay, right? But what I'm naming then is, like, if Mark Lamont Hill is speaking about the ways in which patriarchy, he's in his reflection space, right? Of like how those things have affected him and how many things he's had to revisit in order to correct. I want us to understand that that is a small snippet into sort of the greater idea that if men are being asked in a certain way to be accountable to patriarchy, what does it look like for women to be asked to be accountable to the structure to which you, EJ, said we've been put in, right? I say we, I identify as a woman. What does it look like to be accountable to that structure? Because then, you know, we're not even naming trans women in this moment. We're seeing Mark Lamont Hill's idea of patriarchy, and we're using it around cisgendered women. But then when we think about trans women, now cisgendered women have to do some of that work that Mark Lamont Hill is naming. And I'm excited to get to Laverne Cox's essay. If you're not familiar with Laverne Cox, she was once described as America's sweetheart. I'm not making that up. She's the new Meg Ryan. She's also on Pose and many things. But I think it's important for us that when we speak about patriarchy and feminism in these terms, we also remember them outside of the gender binary. You know, feminism and patriarchy are ways to describe sort of like the martyrdom, patriarchy, man, woman lens. And I think in Black body, our sense of vulnerability or our sense of shame and our sense of grace, we are obliged to do it with Black trans folks. You know, that's our obligation. So I'm excited to see how we move in that.
Yeah,
Any
and I think
thoughts?
it's
You got it, Greg.
yeah. Because obviously Laverne Cox is eventually coming up, but so far I think all the essays are very much adhering to the binary.
Yep.
Whereas even the ones that are written by queer people, it's like they don't even really delve into the queerness so much. Like I believe the disabled writer as well is the only one that's like openly queer from what I can tell so far, unless I'm blanking out on anybody.
Prentice Hemphill.
Prentice as well.
Prentice does write about queerness a little bit, yes.
Yeah, so but even so, it's still very much along the binary. So, you know, Mark Lamont Hill pays a little lip service to including, I believe, trans. I just had the page, but he does mention like a sentence or two of them needing to be. Yeah, but it's very minimal. So it is, I think, adhering to the binary. And actually, the thought I just had after reading all 5 of these essays and just all of them so far is that I think what this book suffers from is that each essay would benefit from the analysis of the other writers. So it's hard to explain it, but it's like, yes, you have this disability lens when the writer who's disabled is writing, but I feel like the church writer would have been benefited by a queer lens, you know, and so forth. It's like it needs to kind of intersect more because it's like seems very siloed when you're looking at it. Like, all right, here's the cis man, here's the disabled queer person, here's just the church goer. It's like, and really, if you're ignoring the other aspects, like the church essay was just begging to mention that queer people do not feel at home in the church. Yeah. And that's not mentioned at all in that essay. It's
a
like
lot
it's
of people don't feel at home in the church.
Right, I know, but I'm saying being a queer person, it's like it's particularly hostile. And it's like that's not even mentioned at any point. Yeah. So it's like I feel like each essay would benefit from the perspective of other people.
Yeah, I can see that too, but I definitely see that. And the only other thing I'll name is that there is kind of a levity though for me in navigating the book in Black body, because then regardless of whatever my identity is, I feel like I get to go into pockets. You know what I mean? Like now I'm visiting this pocket of healing. I could take what I need from that and go somewhere else. You know, I wonder if I would be too overwhelmed by everyone's thoughts together, but I'm navigating the book differently, you know? So, but I really appreciate you saying that. What else?
And I wonder if that would even work. We would have to get a different, we probably would have to get a different set of writers because it's not easy to write and put yourself in the shoes of the other person's experience if you haven't experienced it. It's hard. It's hard to do because even if you're writing prose and fiction or whatever, trying to create, when you create character, some writers, female writers, will have a hard time putting in a male character because they're not that able to get into that headspace, and vice versa with some male writers. So it's kind of hard. So I don't know if these people would be even willing to try that experiment, to write that. And that's and actually we should probably write that down and send it to the two authors and see if they could get that going for the next book.
Right? Because that'd be a good playoff, vulnerability, shame, seeing how other people take that risk. It reminds me of the Jimmy Audrey conversation that I keep bringing up 100 times. I'll bring it up for every book from now on. But you know, they challenged each other on the levels in which they had to feel shame and vulnerability. It was like, I appreciate you, but I'm gonna challenge you a little bit. How bad is your shit compared to mine? Now, it's not always the healthiest thing, but it was compelling. And I do see where that'd be helpful. Ron, please, you were saying something.
I was just going to add that I think Brené Brown could have done that same thing by introducing each writer before the writer's essay, like why she chose this writer in the context of what they will be writing on. I felt like that could have served as a transition between each essay, because like everyone is saying, you know, some of these essays are really varied and they're right next to each other, you know, and I think some kind of transition by either both editors or if this is a whole other issue, I feel like we're giving Brené Brown more credit than Tarana Burke.
Yeah, I was gonna say, did Tarana, maybe Tarana edited it.
So I don't know their roles, but even the writers themselves are referencing Brené Brown, but no, I haven't heard anyone reference Tarana Burke yet, which is interesting.
In my mind, I thought Tarana curated all of the writers together for Brené. Is that not right? Is that wrong? Does anyone have clarification? Tiffany, what was you gonna say?
I said, y'all trying to rewrite the book, and the ladies put forth the book. I mean, Greg wants like an appendage with everybody's responses. Ron wants like a little afterthought after each chapter. I mean, I can take the book either way, one of those ways. It's totally fine with me. I was just gonna say that Lamont had some really good takeaways. Like one of his was that, you know, women are always considered as being so emotional. But the way that men react often in bursts of violence and maybe yelling are emotional acts as well. So it's just so hypocritical and ridiculous to only name women as being emotional. And then I also liked when he said that, you know, it's one thing to be in the public space and be like, yeah, rah, rah, rah for women. I'm a feminist and, you know, I'm up for women's rights and blah, blah, blah. But then when he's in a smaller space, he cowers and doesn't really say anything. And I feel like that's the more productive space to try to check other men with these kinds of issues, is in a smaller space where you can really relate to them and they can take you seriously, rather than a larger stage where perhaps they can get defensive and embarrassed. And I thought that was like, that just needs to be like on the speakers, just like blared out to everybody, like just take men aside in small groups and speak to them.
Right. I also think it's I think something he didn't name that I wish he would have named was the performative aspect of calling things out in a large group circumstance when it comes to men and women. Like, just full disclosure. I know I was complaining about that I'm lonely, but y'all know I'm pretty. You heard Susan say it. You know how many cis men?
You're pretty.
Oh, Susan, you say it all day. You know how many cis men?
You have a lot of guys, I'm sure.
Oh my God, Susan, you're so nice. You know how many cis men have come up to me during rallies, right? Like BLM rallies, or just, man, anything, trying to perform allyship, or trying to perform like, oh, I'm here for you, or trying to perform feminism, and really like they were just trying to get my number or Instagram. You know, and that's like a very common thing, and that's something that y'all could go back to your lives and say, yep, girl, I remember when that happened to me in a different way, but he ain't asked for my DM, he asked for something else, right? Like, this is a common tactic, that the performative aspect of men checking other men, of course, it may lead to violence and embarrassment. But for me, I also was like, yeah, and it's like another way of engaging in the patriarchy, because you just want to show everybody that you're a nice guy, or you're a good guy, or you're a guy that gets it, you know? So I wish he would have just named that a little bit more, because I was like, yeah, brother, and how do you take men apart? How do you then take men into that small space? You know, like, let's name that that's performative. And we talk about it with white people a lot in these last 2 years about performative allyship, you know, when companies want to say Breonna Taylor's name and BLM, but they don't really give a crap about it. You know what I mean? I feel like sometimes often cis men in large settings kind of perform this allyship that's not real.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone else feel that way or just say that? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We could think about all the Black men that came to Russell Simmons' defense when Oprah tried. Oh shoot!
No,
my battery. My battery. Like all the men that came to his defense when Oprah tried to do her documentary, and then they turned it on Oprah and tried to drag her. And still to this day, I haven't heard any people publicly condemning Russell Simmons, just taking him down. Like he just keeps popping up, like just there.
Right. Aside from that HBO documentary, which there are some men artists in Africa. Have you seen it where it's about the woman who he actually?
Right. Yeah, I've seen it.
I'm trying to figure. I forget what recording. There are rappers or there's someone in that documentary that I think they're the only famous person I've seen to kind of denounce Russell Simmons in that way, but I haven't because they're part of the documentary. Like I haven't seen anyone else. So you're absolutely right. This idea of protect Black women. We saw it again in the media recently in Young People News when Megan Thee Stallion was allegedly shot by another famous young artist in the foot. And we saw a lot of, and it was around the time of Breonna Taylor's Protect Black Women. And people were also just naming like, no, girl, you didn't get shot, or girl, you deserved it, you know? So.
We also got to remember Bill Cosby's out of jail.
Come on, Bill Cosby's out of jail. Oh my God, Paula, you forgot the most important thing. Bill Cosby's out of jail.
This is crazy on his face.
Literally trying to go on tour.
Yeah.
And all the people in America who buy the gag gifts for the tour. I shouldn't even say that because people will support that. But you're absolutely right. Naming how Robert, I don't even want to say his name.
Kelly.
Yeah, thank you for saying it. I didn't want to. Naming how Robert, I was gonna say Robert Belly or something stupid, but y'all wouldn't have gotten it. Naming how Robert still has support.
Oh,
that
yeah.
man still has support, and folks, women who write to him, right? Men who write to him. So what I want to name about Mark Lamont Hill's essay and any other essay that we see that's kind of touching patriarchy, I want us to name like what's relatable for you in that. Okay, you don't have to be a man necessarily. You don't have to be a woman necessarily to kind of pick out like what is relatable. How do we use vulnerability and shame as we navigate patriarchy? And what stories have been shared with us, given that it's two cis women who are creating the book, you know? So I want y'all to keep that here, on your sleeve, here, whatever fits, but keep that around somewhere. With a cool 9 minutes, I'm just gonna give off some announcements for next week, and then I wanna touch on anything else folks have to say. But don't forget that we're meeting again next week. It's gonna be great. This essay by Mark Lamont Hill is called Never Too Much, just in case for anyone who was asking before. And next week, we're going to be experiencing pages 109 to 153. So, you know, do your best to catch up. If you don't, you know, we're not tripping here. And I'm going to read the names of the essays to you, just in case you're reading it from a Kindle or something that doesn't have pages. You know what I'm saying? So here we go. The first essay is Filling Every Page with Joy, Rewriting Trauma and Shame by Kaya Nadira. Then we have Honoring Our Stories, Transforming Our Pain by Duran Young. Then we have Running Out of Gas by Sonia Renee Taylor. And lastly, My Journey, Vulnerability, Rage, and Being Black in the Art World by Irene Antonia Diane. And I really, really, really hope that folks are able to at least get through some of these essays, if not most of them. And I'm gonna name that there, at least off the top of my memory, there are two that are really, really intense. So I want you to take care of yourselves as you're reading it and maybe even come back and share. And Ron, also, thank you, Ron, also noted that that's chapters 11 to 14. So again, I gave you page numbers, allegedly. I gave you essay names. I gave you chapter numbers. Okay, you could always go online and look it up. with a cool 8 minutes left, is there anything else that folks want to share? Anything that stood out to you about, or maybe if it's helping you, you know, anything you want to share? Ron is the best. Agreed.
That's the most important thing to share. I am the best.
Oh my goodness.
You know what's interesting to me, and forgive me, Tiffany, for continue to rewrite the book, but how diverse these essays are. It almost doesn't feel thematic. I mean, we know there is a theme, just because, and I think it's more of a theme because we are attaching the gravity that Tarana Burke brings to the book. I wasn't familiar with Brené Brown before this book came out. But these essays are almost too diverse in subject matter. I think they're all good, and I think, you know, they all kind of fit into the book, but, you know, they can feel kind of like all over the place at times. That's why I want Brené Brown to do a little chapter in between each essay.
Well, why has it got to be Brené? Why can't it be Tarana Burke?
Either one. Either one.
Maybe Brené got it right because she's white and we want Tarana to take a nap. You know, there's many reasons. We can figure it out. But I do want to name something wrong that you touched on, is that I think that for me, I definitely feel you. Like, it doesn't feel like a thematic read, even though it clearly is. But I think for me, that's the reprieve. I think if I was literally so conscious that I'm reading about vulnerability and shame for everything, I don't know if I'd be able to get through the book for real. You know, we've had books here in book club where I've had to take them. I mean, even in Zami, I remember one week, y'all will never know, but one of these weeks I was behind and then I caught up because it was like, there were some parts that were just too intense. I wished for sort of I was able to anticipate where Lord is going to take us. And I kind of like that in this, there's no anxiety for me. I can't really anticipate where it's going to go. I just kind of have to trust in whoever's occupying my space at the time. You know, it's like a late night show. What do you mean, Paula? I mean, like when late night shows come on and there's different guests and you kind of like, you know, if you have to watch 1 hour of Al Pacino, after 20 minutes, you're like, all right, brother, I get it. You're Al Pacino. But if now they're telling you they're going to add in Drake and Emily Dickinson, they somehow got her from the dead and whatever, then you're like, oh shit, I'm going to watch this. So I feel like that's how I'm taking in the book. Y'all are laughing at me, but I'm really not trying to clown. I'm serious. Like I take it like, oh, a new guest, you know, or like, oh, a new host. What about y'all?
If I weren't reading this with the book club, I would be tempted, and the book made it easier to just go to the authors I was most familiar with first because they aren't connected.
Right.
But reading it with the book club, we are reading it sequentially, but I think anthologies really sometimes aren't meant to be read that way. I mean, you pick something up, you're attracted to it because Laverne Cox had this essay in here. And so I would probably have read Laverne Cox first and then gone to my next favorite person.
Linda, I wouldn't do that here, but you are. That's real. We often in book club, and that just challenges me a certain way because Ron does break it up in chapters that are super appropriate for me. I'm like, thanks, Ron, that's perfect. But I do wonder what you're naming. Like, are there some stories that we can kind of pull from and be sporadic with and maybe not have to do it in sections? So thank you. Just clap it up for creativity, innovation. Please, come on. You know how we give love at book club. Why y'all acting brand new? Oh, thank you. Tiffany, you were chatting.
I was gonna say, I think I differ from you guys. I like to be emotionally moved. If I'm reading or watching something that is designed to be emotional, I don't mind getting worked up about it. Like just a sidebar, is it HBO Max? There's Black and Missing. It's a documentary about missing Black and brown kids. And it is so heavy. It is so depressing and it's awful. Yeah, and I did a marathon, like a 3-hour marathon. And afterward, I was like, that was just awful. But I needed to get the information, and I don't mind because it was just so well done. So I wouldn't skip chapters because I have faith in the editors that they know what the heck they're doing, and they've placed them in a perfect order so that for whatever reason. So, and just to say, like Laverne Cox, I love Laverne Cox, but who's to say that her article is any more insightful than somebody who's a little bit lesser known? So
Absolutely. But I think to Linda's point about Laverne was that, like, one of the things that drew me to the book was knowing that she had an essay. So maybe instinctually, for my own freedom, for my own healing, for my own, why I gotta go, maybe I just had to go through who spoke to me. I think that's not how I read it, but I think that's what Linda is naming. Like, our ability to even use the book can change. It reminds me of when we did Olio as a group.
Yeah.
At this point, I don't know when that was.
February.
Right? But it reminds me of Olio, that we got to play with it. We didn't have to take it that way. So thank you, though. I think Tiffany, what you're also naming, though, is that a good editor, especially in a book about trauma, in a book about healing, a good editor is going to craft it like a nice piece of furniture. You're going to experience it from the beginning to end in a way that you get to walk away feeling good. So I just think that it's brilliant what we're naming tonight, because there's so many ways that we can navigate our healing. With one